Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're cracking open the historian's dossier to uncover the incredibly real and frankly shocking roots of Bram Stoker's Dracula. You know the cape, you know the fangs, you know the Gothic castles. But what if I told you the true origin of the world's most famous monster is actually buried in a quiet, freezing cemetery in New England?
So, let's jump right in with a question that completely flips how we look at Gothic literature. What if the vampire myth wasn't born from pure imagination, but from a tragic medical misunderstanding? To really get this, we have to strip away all the Hollywood glitz and look at the terrifying, on-the-ground reality of the 19th century.
Picture this. We're not starting in a misty Transylvanian village. It's January 17, 1892, in a frozen churchyard in Exeter, Rhode Island. A group of desperate, terrified neighbors are huddled together in the bitter cold, digging up the grave of a 19-year-old girl named Mercy Brown. She'd only been dead for 2 months. And listen, they weren't grave robbers looking for jewelry. They were looking for a monster.
But the real monster here? It was entirely microscopic. It was tuberculosis, the 19th century's deadliest plague. Before we understood germ theory, TB was this invisible, creeping killer. It struck out of nowhere and moved relentlessly through families, one person at a time. And the symptoms were bizarrely specific: massive weight loss, pale skin, but then a sudden, peculiar flush that actually made victims look almost unearthly and beautiful right before the end. To scared locals watching their loved ones waste away like melting candles, it didn't look like an infection. It looked like something was slowly feeding on them.
That sheer terror is exactly what birthed this brutal folk remedy, a literal New England vampire test. When Mercy Brown's brother, Edwin, started getting sick, the town panicked. They dug up Mercy, and because it was the dead of winter, her body was naturally preserved. They found liquid blood in her heart and took that as absolute proof she was feeding on her brother from beyond the grave. In a desperate attempt to cure him, they burned her heart, mixed the ashes with water, and actually forced Edwin to drink it. Tragically, it didn't work. Edwin died just 2 months later.
Now you'd think a gruesome, bizarre story like this would just stay buried in rural Rhode Island, right? No way. The sheer sensationalism of this vampire panic blew up. It made international headlines. It was this wild story of American superstition that completely grabbed the attention of the public all the way across the Atlantic.
And here is where we have the literal paper trail to prove it. When historians went digging through Bram Stoker's personal research files after he died, guess what they found? These exact historical newspaper clippings from the Boston Globe and the Providence Press, detailing the Rhode Island panics and Mercy Brown's exhumation. Stoker had clipped them out and saved them. He was actively studying this real-life horror as it happened.
And the timeline is the real kicker here. Stoker published his masterpiece, Dracula, in 1897. That is exactly 5 years after Mercy Brown was pulled from the freezing ground. It's not a coincidence. The historical newspaper accounts of these tragic events were absolutely vital to his creative process.
Let's actually put the facts side by side. Look at the direct, frankly undeniable parallel between Mercy Brown and Stoker's fictional character, Lucy Westendra. Both were 19-year-old women suffering from a mysterious, wasting illness. Both were exhumed after death by people who were absolutely terrified they were feeding on the living, and both required a brutal physical ritual to stop them.
So it really begs the question, did Stoker basically use Mercy Brown as his direct model for Lucy? The evidence points to a huge yes. The extreme violence in the novel, staking the heart, cutting off the head, the garlic, it isn't just gratuitous horror he made up. It's a mirror reflecting the frantic, desperate folk remedies practiced by terrified real-world people.
Which leads us to a massive paradigm shift. We all read Dracula for the spooky castles and the bats, but what if we've been reading it wrong this whole time? Is Dracula actually a cutting-edge Victorian medical thriller, just cleverly disguised as a Gothic ghost story?
Well, it makes total sense when you look at who Bram Stoker actually hung out with. He wasn't just a guy who liked scary stories. His family was deep into the medical field. His uncle William was a top physician at a major fever hospital in Dublin. His brother Thornley was a distinguished surgeon. Stoker was writing right in the middle of this massive, contentious debate about germ theory, the idea that invisible little organisms were spreading cholera or tuberculosis. That was hot, controversial, brand new science.
And if you decode the novel using that science, it reads almost like a medical journal. Think about it. The vampire's bite, that's your vector of infection, a puncture wound. The drinking of blood mirrors the highly experimental, incredibly dangerous blood transfusions they were trying back then. The old lore that vampires can't cross running water, That's the brand new scientific understanding that disease breeds in stagnant pools, not clean flowing streams. And when Van Helsing sterilizes the boxes of Earth with the Eucharist, that is literally the scientific logic of quarantine and source elimination.
Seeing it laid out like this completely flips the script. Stoker basically took the terrifying everyday reality of the tuberculosis epidemic and systematically translated it onto the page. He was taking these ancient, folksy fears and rewiring them with the emerging scientific vocabulary of the industrial age.
But hold on, because there's another layer in this dossier we need to look at, the sociological code. Stoker's monster also tapped into some of the deepest, darkest anxieties of Victorian society, the intense fear of the monster from elsewhere.
You'll actually see this specific phrase, a whirlpool of races, used a lot by commentators describing late Victorian London. Now, as historians, we have to look at this neutrally, but this phrase clearly highlights a profound xenophobia and anxiety about immigration at the time.
In the novel, the vampire is explicitly the foreign invader. Dracula comes from the east to infiltrate London. He brings swarms of rats and filth, which historically mirrors the prejudiced fears of the era regarding refugees settling in London's East End, fears of bringing physical and moral infection. And realistically, epidemic diseases like cholera genuinely did arrive via trade routes from the colonies. So Dracula becomes the terrifying embodiment of contamination coming from somewhere else, literally arriving at Britain's doorstep using modern ships and railroads.
So what actually causes a vampire panic? It happens right at the intersection of ancient superstition and industrial age science. It's that terrifying blind spot. A society sees a disease spreading. They know it's contagious, but they don't quite have the modern medical vocabulary of germs and bacteria to explain it yet. So they reach for the oldest, scariest story they know.
And that potent mix, disease, the unknown, the fear of the outsider, is exactly why the vampire myth didn't just fade away in the 19th century. It continues to completely captivate us, constantly evolving in modern literature.
We still see this legacy brilliantly alive today. Take a look at the massive critical acclaim for the modern poetry collection Vampire Verses by LindaAnn Lo Schiavo. It just goes to show that these deep, gothic themes of memory and disease still resonate heavily with readers right now.
Her work, which includes Always Haunted as well, has snagged the Excellence in Literature Award and the Bookish Reader's Pick Award. Critics rave about her vivid imagery and technical range, noting how she essentially turns every single poem into a miniature ghost story. If you want to see how these haunting themes evolve past Stoker's era, her writing is an absolutely perfect modern companion.
But let's bring it all back to where we started. The physical proof of this incredible history is still sitting quietly in Rhode Island. You can actually go visit Mercy Brown's grave today. It's not a monument to a supernatural monster. It's a monument to the real face of fear and a family that was just devastated by an invisible plague.
So, I'll leave you with this to wrap up our explainer. Every new epidemic brings its own fears, right? Its own search for a cure. Does the vampire endure simply because the plague endures? As long as we fear mysterious illnesses working silently through our blood, the monster is probably always going to be waiting. Thanks for diving into the dossier with us today.